Okay, so for tonight, remember you're finishing up Reflection 1. And for Thursday, you are going to do Assignment 5 on page 177 of Writing Analytically. So let's just take a look at that for a minute so that everybody understands what it's asking you to do. All right, so this is the one that's labeled, Write a paper following the template for organizing papers using 10-on-1. Now you will find that template on page 173 in the textbook, so just try to follow that pattern. And essentially what you're going to do is expand on your first reflection, right? So you'll submit these tonight, I'll grade them tomorrow, and then try to expand on these for Thursday night. So what you're going to want to do is try to get about double the length, or you're going to want to try to get about 1,000 words. This is going to be the basis for the first longer paper, which we're going to work on all of next week, right? So we're going to talk about thesis statements and building stronger thesis statements on Thursday. And then both sessions next week are going to be devoted to giving you time to write the paper and to get feedback on your papers, right? So I think I had a peer review scheduled for next Thursday. I think what I'm going to do instead on next Thursday, because it's hard to safely do a peer review in person, and frankly, online peer reviews usually suck. So I think what I'll do is individual conferences with you instead, right? So we'll just do an individual conference via Blackboard when we would normally be meeting in class to talk over what you're doing and what you still need to finish and all that. And that'll be that. So does anybody have any questions about anything? Okay, so I'll give you the full assignment sheet for paper 1 on Thursday, but you're already working on it, right? The exploratory reflection is part 1 of that. So this is something that you're already doing. Now, one thing that I do want everybody to be cognizant of as you are working on really any paper for this class or any other is the subject of the chapter that I wanted you to read for today, right? I want everybody to be cognizant of the distinction between claim and evidence, and what it is you're really supposed to do with these things, and what the relationship is between them, right? So, how do we distinguish between these two things? Right? What's a claim? And what is evidence?
I think claim is not what you claim you think is true.
Okay, yeah. So, claim is a statement that is not on its own objectively true, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. It has to be demonstrated, it has to be proven, right? And then what about evidence?
That's what proves a claim, or that's what proves a statement or an action.
Okay, and let's, I know this is the way we're often used to thinking about evidence, right? The relationship between evidence and claim, right? Mm-hmm. We make a claim, right? We have an opinion, an argument about something, and we use evidence to support it. And while that's not untrue, I want us to try to rethink that relationship a little bit, because I want to try to kind of move in the opposite direction that we're used to going with these things. So if a claim is a statement that's not objectively true on its own, what might we be able to infer evidence is?
It's true on its own.
Yeah. So yeah, if we're looking at evidence, we're looking, right, like at data or facts, right? We're looking at something that is objectively true. So when we think about claims, I want you to think of them not so much as things that need evidence to prove them, rather try to think of a claim as an interpretation of evidence. Right, you have this set of data, this set of facts in front of you, right? And the claim is what you generate from that set of facts, right? The claim is your interpretation, your reading of that set of facts. I know that like the way a lot of us learn to write papers early on in particular is to start with a claim, right? And then to try to muster evidence to support it. That is a process that we call deductive reasoning. And when we reason deductively, what we're doing is taking a general principle as our starting point and applying a specific case to it. So you might remember a couple of weeks ago, we did a little bit of practice with syllogisms, right? Humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Right? This is a classic example of deductive reasoning, right? General principle, specific case. The problem is, in most of the thinking that you're going to have to do in your day-to-day lives and in other classes, this model won't be so easy to follow. So what we want to do instead is reason inductively. And inductive reasoning works the opposite way, right? You have a set as your starting point of specific facts or evidence, and you use that set of data, that set of evidence, to come up with a general principle, with a wider argument. You may recognize that this is the basic model that I'm asking you to follow in this exploratory reflection, right? You start with your close analysis of this piece of text, and then you're supposed to work your way towards a thesis, right? Ending the paper with the thesis. So, this is how most good thinking actually starts, right? Through close observation of something that you can then come up with some general ideas about, right? So this is one of the things we're going to practice today. But first, I want to make sure that everybody can recognize a claim and a piece of evidence when they see one, right? So I'm going to put some examples on the board, and you are going to tell me which example is the claim and which is the evidence. So these are mostly taken from works of cultural criticism of the early 20th century, because that's what I happen to study. So this is what I have available. Our first example being the one exception to that rule. Okay. That's not what I'm trying to do. All right. All right. Andrew Jackson, as president, sent the Cherokee forcefully from their lands in Georgia to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. This action is part of a pattern of racist policymaking on Jackson's part. Which would be the claim and which would be evidence?
I think the evidence is the top part and then claim the bottom.
Okay, yeah. The evidence is a factual historical event, right? And yeah, and the claim, the second sentence, is an interpretation of that event, right? Other interpretations of this are possible, right? So that is one thing that can help you recognize a claim, right? Is that it is possible to disagree with a claim. It is generally not possible to disagree with a piece of evidence, right? All right, good. Second example here. So this comes from a book by George Orwell called The Road to Wigan Pier. He was examining working and living conditions for mine workers in the north of England in the 1930s. So first sentence, middle-class people are fond of saying that the miners wouldn't wash themselves properly even if they could. But this is nonsense. Second sentence. Where pithead baths exist, right, that is bathing facilities that are right there at the mine, practically all the men use them. So which is the evidence and which is the claim? What's that?
The first one will be claim. And,
Okay.
second will be evidence.
Yeah, what's the dead giveaway that the first one is claim? Okay, fond of saying seems to attribute opinion to someone, right? And in fact, there are actually kind of two claims embedded in here, right? One is the claim that middle-class people make, and the second is Orwell's claim about what middle-class people say, right? So yeah, but this is nonsense is clearly kind of interpretation of someone else's opinion, right? And the other thing that would indicate to us that this is evidence, right, is that this is something that, well, at least in the 1930s, you might not have figures for it now, right? But at least in Orwell's time, this was something you could have checked up on, right? If it's something you can look up to see whether it's true or not, if it's something that there would be records of, right, something like that, right, then it's probably evidence and not a claim. All right, doing great so far. So this next example is from an essay by the German art critic Walter Benjamin. It's called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproductions, right? So it's the basic gist of the essay is about how our attitudes towards art have changed now that we're able to use machines to reproduce works of art, right? The first sentence, the Greeks knew only two procedures technically reproducing works of art. Founding and stamping. And the second sentence, mechanical reproduction of a work of art represents something new. All right, which is the claim and which is the evidence?
Evidence would be the top and claim would be the bottom.
Okay, justify that. Why do we think the evidence is the top one?
It says that they only know two.
And then like states them. And then
Yeah.
the second one just like misrepresents something.
Yeah, thus because of this, right, because I know this, right, it follows this, right? Yeah, good. Absolutely right. All right, last one. This is from a book by a black psychoanalyst from Martinique, writing in the 40s, called Frantz Fanon. He's writing about the relationship between European cultures and colonized African cultures. It's called Black Skin, White Masks. And he's writing here about the French army, right? So the first sentence, in the French colonial army, the black officers serve, first of all, as interpreters. And the second sentence, the colonized is elevated above his status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. Okay, so which is which here? Which is the claim and which is the evidence and why? Which of these feels more like a fact and which feels more like an interpretation of a fact? Okay, yeah, this is something you could look up, right? If you had records of the French colonial army, right, you could go through and see, to what kinds of jobs black officers were assigned, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, this second statement is an interpretation of that fact. Good. So, we recognize the difference between claim and evidence. You guys actually clearly have no problems with this, right? But once you've got this distinction down, right, there's a third element that we need to work into our own writing, right? One thing that beginning composition students often tend to do is assume that the relationship between claim and evidence is clear and obvious, right? That given this piece of evidence, well, obviously, I can make this claim, right? The part that y'all usually leave out is your justification for making that claim based on that piece of evidence, right? What your instructors are going to need to see, or what anybody you're having a debate with is going to need to hear, is what justifies making that claim based on that piece of evidence, right? What's the logical connection between the two? So there's a method that we have for testing this. was developed by a British rhetorician and philosopher of language by the name of Stephen Toolman. And it's just called the Toolman method of argumentation. It looks a lot like the syllogism. Right, so the basic Toolman model, there is a more complex version that we're not going to bother with that has about 8 different elements. We're going to do a simplified version that really only includes 3, right? So if I say, right, I make the claim, I am a US citizen, and I follow that up with the data, the term that Toolman uses kind of interchangeably with evidence, that I was born in Pennsylvania. The thing we need to figure out is what Toolman calls the warrant, right? And the warrant is that logical link between the data and the claim, right? So why am I able to make this claim based on this piece of data? Why can I say that I'm a US citizen because I was born in Pennsylvania?
Is it part of the US?
Yeah, because Pennsylvania is in the United States. And anyone born on US soil is a citizen, right? I've got my claim, I've got my data, I've got my warrant, right? So what this warrant often is kind of similar to the kinds of implications that we've been pulling out of a lot of the things that we've been reading, right? The warrant is usually going to be implied rather than clearly stated in things that you read, but in things that you write, I want you to clearly connect the claim and the data by giving me a warrant, right? So let's do a little bit of practice with this as well. First, a couple of simple examples, and then we will maybe try to apply it to some of these things that we've got up here that are slightly more complex. All right, so I'm going to make the claim, and I'm going to preface this claim by saying that I know absolutely nothing about any sport. I do not know which teams are good and which teams are not. I have not followed baseball closely since I was a child. But I do remember that when I was a kid, the Detroit Tigers were arguably the best team in baseball. So we're just going to go with that. All right, so my claim is that the Tigers will win the World Series this year. The data or grounds that I'm using to make this claim is that they have the best pitching in the league. Again, whether or not this is true, it still works as an example, right? So what is the warrant here? What am I thus arguing about what wins baseball games?
You're arguing that pitching wins baseball games?
Yeah, that the team with the best pitching will win, right? Good. All right. Let's try another one. This one, in the world, in the often the always contentious and always difficult world of national politics. I'm going to make the claim that the next Democratic convention should be held in Milwaukee. The data I am going to use to back this up is that the party narrowly lost Wisconsin in 2016 and barely won the state in 2020. So what's the warrant that links these? Yeah, that placing a convention in a must-win state makes it more likely to win the state, right? Yeah, the convention should be held in contested states that you need to win. All right. So I think we get the basics here. Now, what I would like to try to do now is an exercise in generating your own claims from a set of evidence. So I've got a handout here. I want you guys to work slowly, work carefully, take your time. I want you to look at these different pieces of data, all of which have to do with urban and suburban development in the U.S. in the 20th century. There are three more on the back. What I want you to do is go through this list, and I want you to look for links between these pieces of evidence, right? Look for patterns. Look for repetition and similarity. Look for binary oppositions. Look for things that don't seem to fit. Pull out the implications in each of these statements. And I want you to try to come up with at least 3 separate claims about the evidence presented here. Each of your claims should account for more than one piece of evidence and make sure that you can explain the logical connection between the evidence and the claim that you're trying to make, okay? So take your time, we're in no hurry. Ask questions if you have them. And try to come up with a couple of good interpretations of this data. And again, if there's something in one of the data points here that you don't understand, just, feel free to ask for clarification. Okay, so let's pause for a second and just see how you're doing in terms of recognizing patterns here. So have you guys managed to find any strands in this? Like any things that seem to repeat across these data points?
It's a lot like either like before 1950 or after 1950, just like that time period.
Okay, yeah, so time, particularly in terms of historical era, seems to be a pattern here, right? Okay, yeah, a lot of these reference time, like what's going on in different times. Okay, good. What else? What else do you notice is strands of repetition or similarity?
There's two sentences like how garages are different like cardboard.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of talk here about garages and carports, right? Okay, that's a common element that runs through a lot of these. Other strands that you guys notice?
Suburban, it's keep repeating.
I'm sorry, Ron, can you say that a little louder?
Suburban.
Okay, yeah, suburban pops up a lot here. Anything else? Anything that's, maybe more of like an implied repetition? Okay.
Just like how we learned before a certain time, how they're different now. Like how towns are different.
Yeah, and we can probably relate that to this first strand that has to do with time, right? Good, okay. What about binaries? What sorts of things do you notice are in opposition here? Where do we see things that are being contrasted with each other?
The two sentences in the back, like that says urban neighborhoods include like residential real estate and stuff like that. And then this is while in suburban neighborhoods different land uses are strictly separated by zoning laws. And then the sentence below it was like they oppose building of new housing units, schools, and rental centers near the homes.
Okay, yeah, so I think we can probably pull two contrasts out of these, right? Right, I think, yeah, we got an urban versus suburban binary, right? And we've also got kind of like a density versus, I don't really know what to call the other.
Expanded?
Yeah, maybe density versus like expansive or expansion. Yeah, sure. Sprawl. That's, I think, the word I'm looking for, sprawl. Which is the word you often use. Yeah, I choose this word specifically because it's an urban planning word, right? It's used to refer to places that are very spread out, right? All right, where else do we see contrasts here?
I think one more say most American children grow up in suburban neighborhoods, but then towards the bottom, like in the late 90s, children of middle-class suburban families started moving to large cities like New York, Boston, San Francisco. Those aren't really suburban.
They are not, no. So that there seems to be like a contrast here between where you grow up versus where you choose to live, right? Good catch. Okay, keep going. You guys are doing great here. And again, maybe think about some things here that are implied, right? So, for example, if we look we look at this point about grid patterns versus cul-de-sacs, right? While older American towns and cities are set up according to grid patterns, in which multiple walking or driving routes can be used to reach the same destination in the same amount of time, newer cities and suburbs tend to be designed as cul-de-sacs that empty out onto a single feeder road. Does everybody understand what that means, like what that looks like? Yeah, that's
It just ends
it's a big circle with houses in it that empties out from one or 2 points, right, onto a feeder road. Okay, so can we relate that to something about, say, older homes rarely having garages or carports, newer neighborhoods rarely having sidewalks, and garages being as big as the living space in new homes? What contrast are we seeing here between, say, maybe like old America and new America in terms of how people get around?
They mainly walked before because, not everyone had cars. And not everyone
Yeah.
has a bunch of cars. Like they have kids and their kids have cars.
Yeah. And people have cars, in part.
In the garage and car.
Pardon?
In the garage and carport.
Yeah, they have the car in the garage or carport to keep the car in large part because the neighborhood is designed to make you need a car, right?
Yeah. Because there's like the ones that in the suburban roads really offer public transportation.
So there's a transportation strand that runs through this too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we can also connect this to a public versus private binary, right? What about anomalies? Do you see anything in here that doesn't seem to fit a pattern, that doesn't seem to work with anything else?
The one about Disney World or in Atlantic City Boardwalk. No, this is called
Yeah, what seems weird about that to you?
that's the only one really about amusement parks or tourist destinations.
Okay.
It's just carved out from
Okay, yeah, this one is kind of an odd one out, right? Is there anything else that seems like it doesn't quite fit?
Most American children grow up in suburban neighborhoods.
Okay. What seems weird about that one to you?
Doesn't really talk about much about the children, but it's more like the suburbans and.
Okay. Well, we have noticed that there are actually a couple of points that do reference children here, right? But I think we might connect this to this binary here about where you grow up versus where you choose to live, right? Do you have a choice as to where you grow up? You don't get to pick that, right? You grow up typically wherever your parents happen to live, right? So I think that maybe what we're seeing in that contrast is also something about like generation gap, right? Generational contrast, like where people's parents chose to live versus where they choose to live, right? So there's maybe a parents versus children binary we can pull out of that. And again, because these data points are, from the 90s, so they're, 20, they're 20 years old at this point. We can also say that maybe what we're talking about here is a difference between baby boomers and the specific generations that came after them, right? They're Gen X and millennial children. That these might be, perhaps specific generational preferences, right? Okay, so yeah, overall, good stuff here, guys. So what I'd like you to do now is try to work some of these into specific claims, right, that cover at least 3 data points, right? Try to come up with at least 3 separate claims, and each claim should account for, try to get at least 3 of separate points of evidence, right? As many as you can without making the claim wishy-washy, right? take another 3 minutes, just really go over this, see what you can do with them. If you already got 3 claims you're happy with, see if you can come up with 1 or 2 more. Or if you can revise one of your claims to include more information or some such thing. Just try not to feel the soul-crushing weight of this gloomy weather. Okay, so what I would like you to do now is go over the claims that you've written, and I want you to try to rank them from strongest to weakest, right? So remember that a strong claim is going to be fairly specific while still accounting for as much evidence as possible. A weak claim is either vague or supported by very little evidence. So if you've got a claim that's very specific but is supported by only one piece of evidence, that's still a comparatively weak claim, right? If you've got a claim that covers lots of evidence but is really vague or wishy-washy, then that's also a weak claim, right? So yeah, just try to organize them from your best to your worst. Everybody good? Everybody got your claims arranged? Everything ranked? Okay. Ronald, what was your best claim?
Since people in the suburban neighborhoods.
Okay. People in suburban neighborhoods. Okay, keep going.
Do not like new buildings being built around their home, near their homes.
Not like new construction around their homes. Is there more, or is that it? This okay. So this is a little bit close to one of the data points, right? So what we probably need to do is try to develop this a little bit, right? I think what this would need to be a good claim would be to try to answer some kind of why question, right? And I think that we can do this with the evidence we've got, right? So what have we noticed is specific to the design of suburban neighborhoods that they don't share, like, say, with urban neighborhoods? Pardon? Okay, yeah, cul-de-sacs that empty out onto a feeder road, right? Okay, so that's, I think, part of a pattern we're looking at here, right? What do they also typically not have? They typically don't have public transportation, right? Which means if you want to get around, you have to do what? But what else do they typically not have? Yes. So if you want to get around, what do you have to do? You have to drive, right? So then why might suburban residents not like new housing or schools or hospitals or resale centers built near their homes? What's that going to do?
Make people walk around and stuff like that. Just like have more people come through the neighborhood.
Yeah, which is and if the only way to get around the neighborhood is to drive, what's that going to increase? Yeah, it's going to make traffic a lot worse, right? In an area in areas where traffic is already a problem, right? So we can take this and develop the idea, right, and make it into something more argumentative, right? So people in suburban neighborhoods do not like new construction around their homes because they fear the traffic that will result, right? So just, by kind of looking at how this fits with these various pieces of evidence, right, we can develop this into something more argumentative. Okay, good start. Elizabeth, what was your best claim?
I said the amount of people that drive in the 21st century is a lot more than the 20th century.
Okay. And I think that, so the number of people who drive in the 21st century is greater than the number in the 20th. So this has a little bit of the same issue here. We need to make this a little bit more argumentative. So you have actually pulled an observation from the data, but yeah, we need to give this more of an argumentative thrust, right? So again, like I think what we need to ask ourselves here, based on the data we're looking at, is why, right? And does it seem like people are driving more as a matter of personal choice, like driving as a preference, or because they have to, because of the way neighborhoods are designed? Yeah, and I think we can add to that the fact, like this anomaly we noticed about amusement parks and tourism, right? The places people like to go when they don't have to work, right? And the data point here about tourist sites is that these are places where you can't drive, right? You have to park your car outside and then go and walk, right? So when we are enjoying ourselves, we prefer to simply walk. But in our working lives and day-to-day lives, we have to drive. So I think, yeah, this can support the idea that this is the result of planning decisions that are beyond most people's ability to do anything about, not personal choice. Okay, but we get how this works, right? We understand what's going on. Does anybody have any questions about claim, evidence, or generating a claim from evidence? Okay, so remember that for tonight, that first exploratory reflection is due. All right, please do email me if you have questions while you're working. I am happy to answer any questions or concerns that you have. And we'll see you on Thursday to talk about thesis statements. And to get started on your first longer paper.